So I'm here today to tell you about the amazing story of a very inspiring man, George Müller. And I'm just going to try and click so I can see some of you. Can you just give me a wave of your hand if you've heard of George Müller or know a bit about him already? Yeah, lots of you. Oh, that's great. Brilliant. So some of what I'm going to tell you, you'll know, and some you probably won't know. I've got some fantastic images to show you from our archive, from our image library. So I'm excited to show you those. And I'm really hoping that you'll leave today feeling quite inspired by this amazing man who himself travelled the world. So it's George and his 10,000 orphans. So this is George. And as you can see, he lived from 1805 to 1898. Which covered almost the whole of the 1800s, which is quite amazing, isn't it? And to think that the average age of mortality at that point was about 45 years old, and he lived till he was 92. So he did well, and he was a very fit and healthy man. So this is George. This is the house he grew up in. It's in a little town called Kroppenstadt. And it was in Prussia, obviously now Germany, and previously East Germany. And George grew up here, a fairly average childhood, but sadly, tragedy struck when he was just 14, when his mum died. George didn't actually find out that his mum had died until the following day. And that's because George already, by the age of 14, had got himself into some quite tricky habits. He would go out drinking a lot in the local inns. He would gamble and lose money on cards. He would stay over in inns and hostels and not pay the bill. So he was already getting himself into some mischief, and he'd been out drinking with his friends the night his mother died, and so didn't find out until the day after. George, in fact, continued in his ways after his mum's death and got himself into a lot of trouble. And into debt, and actually found himself at the age of just 16 in 1821 in Wolfenbüttel Museum. It wasn't a museum, it was a prison. And you can see it looks pretty grim to me. I don't know about you, I probably wouldn't fancy finding myself alone in a cell at the age of 16 in this place. And George, you might think that George, felt repentant at this point, or felt humbled, or felt guilty maybe about his behaviour. But actually his diary tells us otherwise, and that George, in fact, wasn't particularly repentant, even having been thrown into prison, and was actually he was quite scared, but he was also just fed up and frustrated that he'd been put away. He got chatting with, he asked the prison guards to let him share a cell with another criminal who'd been put there. And he wrote in his diary, "We now passed away our time in relating our adventures, and I was by this time so wicked that I was not satisfied with relating things of which I had been really guilty, but I even invented stories to show him what a famous fellow I was." So you can see that his attitude really wasn't very repentant. He was making up lies about some of his escapades. Anyway, after about 3.5 weeks in prison, George's dad paid for him to be released. And you can imagine George's dad being a bit concerned about the route that his son's life was taking. So he arranged for George to go to university in Halle, in 1825, and he arranged for him to study theology and to train to become a priest. And his reasons for that were not particularly faith-based. They were more based on the fact that a priest would get a good salary and would get a house with the job. So that's what he arranged for him to do. So this is at Halle University, and off George went. But unfortunately, when he was there, again, he still hadn't really changed his ways or seen the error of his ways. And one example was when he arranged a holiday for his friends. He wrote about this in his diary. He said, "I proposed to my friends to set off for Switzerland. The obstacles in the way, the want of money and the want of passports, were removed by me. For through forged letters from our parents, we procured passports, and through pledging all we could, particularly our books, we obtained as much money as we thought would be enough. I was on this journey like Judas, for having the common purse, I was a thief. I managed so that the journey cost me but 2/3 of what it cost my friends. Oh, how wicked I was. So he managed to get his friends to pay for some of his holiday. So yeah, he didn't really change his ways until one night when something astonishing happened to George. He got invited to a meeting of some Christians by his friend Peter, and he heard the word of God, and he heard about God's love for him and the world and all people, and he recognized that the way he'd been living wasn't the right way to live, wasn't a good way to live, wasn't a loving way to live. And he was struck by this, convicted, and that night gave his life to God, to following God. And he wrote in his diary, that evening was the turning point in my life. So he changed direction, literally. He made up his mind that he would never take money from anyone again. And he stopped taking money from his father for his studies. He got a job doing some translation, and begun to try to live a better life and mend his ways. Oh, by the way, that's a photograph of George's Bible, which we have here in the museum, and he's written notes in his Bible, and that's one of our visitors' favourite exhibits, is to see George's Bible and all the little notes he's made and the verses that he's underlined. So George, after finishing his studies, he actually came to England, and he came to London, and he came to become a missionary to the Jews, actually, in London. But when he got there, he became very unwell. In fact, so unwell that he almost died. And he was sent off to Devon to try to get some sea air and to try to recover. And so in 1830, he found himself in Sheldon. Some of you might know Sheldon, you might even live near Sheldon. It's near Teignmouth, between Teignmouth and Torquay. It's a lovely little spot. And he became the pastor of this chapel, Sheldon Chapel. And he met and married this lady, Mary Groves. You may well be familiar with the fact that at that time, when people went to church, they paid to go in. So there was a box at the back of church, and if you were wealthy, you put some money in the box, and you got to sit at the front comfortable seats with a good view. And if you were poor, you put less money in, you sat at the back on the benches. So George and Mary felt convicted that this just wasn't right. They just felt, firstly, that it wasn't right that people felt they had to pay to come to church. And secondly, they felt that it wasn't just that people with less money got the worst seats or got treated differently. And so obviously that money that was in the box was George's salary. So they made quite a risky decision to announce to the church, you don't have to put any money in the box anymore when you come to church. If you want to, you can, but you don't have to. And so he left it to people's consciences. And began to pray to God for the things that he needed. So to live by faith, we sometimes call it, and to trust and rely on God more for what he needed. And sure enough, from that time on, George would sometimes receive donations in the post. Sometimes they would have food delivered to their house spontaneously by people who felt prompted to do that. And George and Mary found that they had enough. They sometimes had very, very little. They sometimes didn't quite know where their dinner was coming from, but something would turn up. And so they lived in this way, actually from that time onwards for the rest of their lives. So let's just, I've got a quote here, but I can't quite see it because I need to shift you all out of the way so that I can see it. Yes, he says in his diary, about this time I began to have conscientious objections against any longer receiving a stated salary. And he said his reasons against it were, number one, the salary was made up by pew rents, Number 2, it might be given grudgingly, and he didn't want people to be tempted to give grudgingly, but to give willingly. And number 3, it might influence my ministry, so by knowing who was giving more. So he was worried about those things, and that's some of the reasons why he decided to ditch the box and live by faith. So in 1832, George was invited with his friend Henry Craik to come to Bristol to pastor this church here. It's called Bethesda Chapel, and I don't know if any of you know Bristol, but this is usually, I put this up for locals or for local school children usually when I'm talking about George, to say this is a very well-known street in Bristol, and the chapel was just off a street to the left, Great George Street. It's not there anymore because it was destroyed in a bombing raid in 1943. But this is the chapel that George became the pastor of with Henry Craik, and they had a very, very prolific ministry there. At one point, they were ministering in other local chapels. At one point, their congregation numbered around 1,000 people, so it was a very multiple services during the day, and a very profound ministry. Lots of people giving their life to God during that time. But at that time, like in many cities in the UK, it didn't look the way it looks today. There were many, many children living on the street. And one of the reasons, I've got this photograph here of some people drawing water from the public well. One of the reasons for the number of orphans hugely increasing in the 1830s was that there were 3 cholera epidemics in the 1830s, the first of which was in 1832. And so there were many children left either living on the streets begging, or they were living and working in the workhouses, working 12, 14-hour days with 1 meal a day, sleeping on the floor, etc. I'm sure you know all about it. And so George and Mary started to give, they felt that they wanted to help, and they started to give bread and water out to some of the children on the street. But they had a growing conviction that God wanted them to do more. And so they began to pray, and they felt convicted that they needed to give shelter to some of these children. So they rented a house in Wilson Street in Bristol, which is still, the street is still there now. That's very near the centre of the city. Well, it's in the centre of the city. And they rented number 6, and they took it, they announced to their church congregation that they felt convicted to do this. And then they just prayed, and people began to send money and gifts in kind to enable them to open this house to 30 orphan girls, which is what they did in 1836. So they opened the home to 30 orphan girls, having not asked anyone for any money and not done any fundraising, but the money had just come in through their prayers, through people feeling prompted to give. And they eventually, over a period of a few years, they eventually ended up renting 4 houses in Wilson Street, and altogether housing 120 girls and boys in those 4 houses. And all of that was done not through any fund. George never asked anyone for money. He did announce his plans, and he was a very charismatic person. And so people knew what he was aiming to do, and people felt prompted to give. Some people often felt prompted to give out of the blue as they were praying. And often those kinds of gifts would come at exactly the right time, when they didn't quite know how they were going to feed the children dinner. And that kind of scenario just happened over and over and over and over again. I can't tell you, if you've ever read George Müller's Diaries, sounds awful. It almost gets boring because it happens so often. His diary is absolutely full of the minutest detail of every single day of what they needed, what they didn't have, and then how it turned up at the right time. It's absolutely astonishing. You almost get to the point where you're just, taking it for granted because it was such a common occurrence. So it's an amazing, amazing ministry. So they had their 120 children in this house, right? I don't know how many of us there are here, and I can't see everybody, but I'm going to take a risk. just to give you a break from my voice. I wonder if anyone would have any suggestions. You could either pop it in the chat function at the bottom, or you could just unmute yourself and say out loud. I wonder what it was like for the neighbours. Any comments? 120 children living on your street, just imagine. What do you think were the problems? Yeah, anybody want?
Was one of them.
Pardon?
The sewers was one of them.
Yeah, you obviously know the story. The sewers, so no flushing loos in the homes. Any other thoughts?
Noisy.
Yeah, really noisy. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? 120 children all in one street. They all, go on, Linda, you've got your hand up.
The other neighbours would be fearful that they would be burgled or their property taken.
Yeah, you're right. There would have been fears around that. These children were used to, many of them were used to begging and stealing to live. So you're right, might have felt like a threat. Anyone else? Okay, fantastic. Yeah, those were all real issues. And so eventually, you may know, George got a letter from a neighbour. It was a polite letter, and it did compliment him on what he was doing. They sort of said, you know, it's great what you're doing, but please, could you go and do it somewhere else? It was a classic sort of case of not in my backyard. So this sent George into a fluster because, well, if George could be flustered, I don't think he's the kind of person who could be actually. But anyway, it sent him into fervent prayer. That's how George always reacted to challenges. Sent him into fervent prayer. He just didn't know what to do, because what many people in Bristol find it hard to understand about, because they see these 5 huge buildings, these 5 huge orphan homes on Ashley Down, which are still here now. They, you know, and they know they're orphan houses. There's a kind of natural assumption that the person who put them there was a wealthy philanthropist. And George's story is completely unique in that sense, and that most people who built amazing things in anywhere, but in Bristol particularly, you know, we've got Isambard Kingdom Brunel building the Clifton Suspension Bridge and the London to Bristol Railway, and you know, they had money behind them, they had backing. George didn't have any financial backing in that sense, or any wealth of his own. So anyway, so George didn't know what he was going to do with these 120 children, so he began to pray. And he worked out that he would probably need, if he began to think that he was going to have to just build a new orphan house somewhere out of the city. Perhaps that would be great, because there'd be more space for them to play, they wouldn't be disturbing anyone, the air would be cleaner. And so he began to pray for £10,000, because that's what he calculated he would need in order to do that. And he would need that to build the building, but also they would need tons of other things. When I'm teaching this story to children, I then usually get them to tell me, you know, what the orphans needed. And I think even with, you know, with a group of adults like this, it's good to actually think about the actual practicalities of saying, I'm going to take 120 children or more potentially, and we're going to look after them and we're going to educate them. Now, the actual things that they needed, it's astounding. You know, he wanted to give them 3 meals a day, not just one. They all had to be clothed, they all had to have shoes, they all needed some kind of way of being hygienic, you know, some way to wash. They needed lighting. And at that point there weren't gas lamps, so it was a lot of it was candlelight. They needed medicine if they got sick. They needed toys, because one of the things that one of the most astounding things about George's orphan homes is that they weren't just homes for them to live in and be safe in. They were really a vehicle for completely changing their social status. They actually wanted to give them a childhood, so that involved toys and playing, and he wanted to give them an education which would completely change the direction of their lives. So all these things were needed, as well as carers to look after them, teachers to educate them, nurses to care for them when they were sick. So this is why the £10,000 was needed. It's not much to us today, obviously, £10,000, but it was a huge amount then. So George did what he'd done before. He just began to pray, and he announced his intentions to the church, and people began to give. Some people who'd given before, in order to open Wilson Street homes, but others began to get on board as well and give. And it took a while. It took about 2 years, 18 months, 2 years, but eventually George had the money to buy this field. He bought this field off somebody who was selling it. The guy that was selling it put it out at a certain price, and George tried to when George saw it was for sale, he tried to contact the guy, but he couldn't get hold of him, and he left a message at his house saying, "I'm interested in your field because I want to build an orphan home for these children that are currently in the city." And the man saw the message. So before he'd even met George, he saw the message, went to bed that night, and woke up at 3 a.m. With a very strong, very troubled, and with a very strong sense that he absolutely should sell that field to George Müller, but that he should sell it at a cheaper price to him. And so that's what happened. They met the next day, and George bought the field for a cut price. And on that field, George built home number 1, which is literally opposite me now. I can't believe, well, I could turn my screen around, but the light from the window, I don't think it works. Anyway, you'll have to take my word for it. Home number 1 is over there. And it was, as the first home, it's got some unique features. It was built, the plan, the kind of floor plan was modelled very much on a kind of workhouse model. And it's the only one with a bell tower, which used to summon the children for meals for school. And it housed 300 children. So George took all the 120 from Wilson Street, and he could take even more children in. And it opened in 1849. There were more and more children who needed housing and education. And so orphans, they had to be full orphans. So they had to have had both mother and father die. And they had to provide proof of that as well. Obviously, it was usually a relative or a neighbour, or sometimes a parish priest, sending the letter of application to George, and asking if he had space for these particular children. Often it was a sibling group. It was rarely just one child. It's usually a sibling group. Sometimes it was part of a sibling group, because perhaps the 2 older children of 4 could be looked after, in fact might be needed by, say, grandma, because to look after her and to earn money, and perhaps it was just the younger 2 siblings that needed caring for. So sometimes it was a part of a sibling group, and he was getting more and more applications, and so hence just continued to pray and continued to receive gifts. This is home number 2. It housed 400 children. I'm sitting in it right now. Our museum is based in home number 2. And for this particular home, a local glazier came out while George was having the building built, and offered to put all the windows in gratuitously. And so that was very typical of people's generosity and wanting to be involved, and of responding to God in terms of their giving. So the work continued, and in 1858, George bought another field, which is just over the way from here, and built home number 3 for 450 children. And then in 1865, he was able to buy another field, and on that he built 2 homes, each housing 450 children. So he was looking after and educating 2,050 children by 1870, which is by any account a lot of children. They were all educated, all clothed, all fed, and in his lifetime, George never ever asked for money, but received gifts totaling, in today's money, more than £100 million. That was how much he received in his lifetime. And in his lifetime, obviously, as these children grew older and left the homes, others came in, and in his lifetime, 10,000 children passed through these homes. Hence the story of George Müller and his 10,000 orphans. this is what the homes actually look like. This is a recent picture of home number 3. They're mostly apartments now. 2 of the homes, 4 and 5, are part of City of Bristol College, and this section of home number 2 is the museum, but all the rest are now apartments, which ironically cost a lot of money to buy. So those are, just to say as well, that the homes, because I'm anticipating a question about this later, the homes were sold off in 1950. So the work continued after George's death, with different people taking over the running of the homes. Firstly, it was George's son-in-law and his daughter, Lydia and James Wright, who took on the homes, but then others succeeded them. And then by the 1950s, as you know, the system was moving away from orphan homes and more into fostering and adoption. And so the homes were sold off by the George Müller Foundation, as it was called then. And with the proceeds, they bought a number of large houses around the city where they housed the leftover orphans. So there weren't many, they were by no means full by then. They were most of them were quite empty. But they took the remaining orphans into those smaller sort of family group homes around the city. And then as those children grew up, by the 1980s, all of those homes were empty and some of those properties were sold off. So yeah, I'll talk a bit more about the legacy and how the work continues today later. So as you might know, George travelled the world in this last part of his life. He set off on his first trip, missionary trip, at the age of 70, which just goes to show, you know, you're never too old to do anything, are you? At 70, he set off on his first trip, and he travelled 200,000 miles over the next 17 years to many, many countries, including New Zealand, Australia, Northern Africa, Japan, China, all over the North America and Europe. And he went everywhere sharing the story of the Bristol miracle, the amazing miracle that had happened in Bristol, where 10,000 children were cared for through prayer, faith, and the generosity of many. He was obviously world renowned by this time. And he was even invited, when he visited Washington, DC, he was invited by President Hayes and his wife for a tour around the White House. And by this time, I should add that Mary, his first wife, had died, and he'd remarried Susanna Sanger. And she was the one who was the real motivation behind the trips, and she organized the trips. She was a great adventurer and traveler. And so, yes, so they had a lovely visit around the White House. You know, and it just always astounds me. I mean, as travelers yourselves, you know, the idea of doing these trips without aeroplanes is quite interesting, isn't it? Sort of, you know, we know that George travelled by, obviously a lot of it was by boat, by train, by horse and cart, on foot, and by donkey. Those are the 5 modes of transport that we know he definitely used, but quite something to travel that far without aeroplanes. And then when George died, the whole of Bristol came to a standstill. All the shops and factories were shut. And this is his funeral cortege. This is his carriage where his coffin is. And here you can see some of the orphan boys in their caps leading the procession up to the church, up that steep hill I showed you before, up Park Street to go to the church. This is the very centre of Bristol. And these people, the streets were absolutely lined with people paying their respects. And when they had finished at the church, they went down to Arnosfell Cemetery, which is a very well-known cemetery in Bristol, and where George was buried. And where he was buried, there were 7,000 people filled the cemetery singing hymns and paying their respects to him and worshipping God for his incredible life of prayer and faith. And he was buried with his wives, Mary and Susanna, in Arnosfell Cemetery. It was like in George Müller's Orphan Homes. So they had a very regimented day. You can imagine that coming into the homes was probably hugely positive and a massive relief in some ways, but also possibly quite scary. You're one little child of hundreds of children, and there's a regimen, you know, there is a strict regimen because there had to be. So you can just imagine some of the mixed feelings and emotions and experiences of some of the orphans. So this was their day. They were up at 6 in the morning. The girls did some knitting, the boys did some reading, breakfast at 8, school in the morning, playtime, lunch, afternoon school, and then another long playtime, and then evening service. They had chapel in their probably in the dining rooms, which would have been the rooms big enough to have them all. Chapel in the evening, tea time, evening activities, which included some chores. There were plenty of chores to be done. Bedtime for the younger children at 8, and then bedtime for the older children at 9. So that was their kind of daily routine. This was school. So this space that I'm in now doesn't look anything like it now because it's been modernized, but it was a schoolroom like this. And, you know, probably doesn't surprise lots of you. Obviously, you can imagine, normally I'm speaking to children who are about 10 years old. They've never seen a classroom that looked like this. It's quite a shock. And they're saying, oh, they're all in lines, and they all look exactly the same in their uniform, and they're all boys and things like this. And you know, it was very, very different to, you know, I mean, I can sort of, you know, I'm old enough to know stories from my dad talking about school being like this back in the 1950s or 40s. So, you know, but it's very alien to children now. So the boys were taught separately to the girls. Mostly the girls and boys learned the same things. They all learned maths, English, history, geography. They all did most of the academic subjects, girls and boys. This is the boys in a PE, well, posing for a photo actually in a PE lesson. Do you remember those huge apparatus when you were at school? I don't know if they let them be that big anymore. Probably don't. And then I mentioned about chores. So the boys would be, you know, doing physical jobs like the gardening, growing vegetables, fresh vegetables for use in the homes. Woodwork would have been something the boys did that the girls didn't do. And again, these are concepts that are quite tricky for children now to grasp, that girls and boys would do different things. But the boys, you know, many of the boys went on to work in practical jobs like carpentry, building, that kind of thing. Looking after the chickens was the boys' domain as well, so they had fresh eggs for the homes. Often some of them went on to be farmers, so that was a useful skill. And then the girls, here's some of the girls in their classroom. We don't know for sure what's going on here. I love, you know, getting people to guess. It could have been that they were learning to tell the time maybe, or learning fractions, or maybe even just doing some stretching. We don't know. Singing, so they didn't have any musical instruments in the homes, so they used a pitch pipe, which is a little kind of whistle almost, with a bit on the end where you could change the note, and so that the singing lead teacher could blow in the whistle so everyone knew to start on the same note. And then in terms of chores, the girls often helped with the laundry. You can see how they all had exactly the same haircut. Probably this photo followed an outbreak of hair lice because it's very short. And I imagine that's when they would cut the hair very short, is when there'd been an outbreak of hair lice. The girls, when they got to 14, as I said earlier, the girls and boys stopped their formal education then. The girls continued to remain at the homes till they were 16 or 17, learning the skills that would help them go into service in a home. So they learned childcare, they looked after some of the younger children, cooking, cleaning, laundry, sewing. The orphan girls' needlework and embroidery is famous around the world. They're samplers. We have some here at the museum. Very, very careful, intricate needlework. They learned cooking, obviously, and they also provided, you know, free labour in the homes. You know, if you've got a lot of 14 to 17-year-old girls helping out with things, it saves a lot of money. The laundry is the bit I can never get my head around. Each uniform had each child had 3 sets of uniform. So in their back of each uniform, they had their orphan number and set number 1, and then set number 2, set number 3, and they'd wear each set for 1 week, and then it would go to the laundry. So by the time they'd worn set 3, set 1 was back in the cupboards. But I mean, no washers or dryers, you know, no radiators to dry things on. They had these huge drying racks. They had huge mangles for wringing out the clothes. Irons that obviously not electric irons, heating up on the cooker to iron everything. And it wasn't just the clothes, it was all the bedding as well. Dormitory wise, they slept like this, some younger children in cots, older children in beds. The girls had to share a bed and the boys didn't, which always causes a bit of consternation among girls that I tell that to. But I always say, well, if you think about it, this fire was the only heating in that room. If I was a girl, I'd rather share a bed because I'd be warmer at night. Yeah. And then playtime, you know, this is the bit that, you know, I find almost gets me most, this bit emotionally, because I think about those children's lives before they came in. The idea of having playtime just would not have come into their world. They would have been trying to survive. But they had these 2 long playtimes every day. The boys with some of their toys. Obviously, they loved all the same things as, you know, any child would, running about, kicking a football about. Obviously, this photo is a bit later. It's not during George's time. You can probably see it. We think this is probably the 1930s. The young boys are often shocked about the size of the ball. When I tell them it was made of leather and would have been quite hard to head, they're quite shocked. The girls with their dolls. Every Christmas, every child got a present. So that was probably the girls' present that year. So we'll get a doll dancing around the maypole in May. Bit of cricket. This is one of the teachers joining in as the wicket keeper. Dressing up, of course. Again, this is a slightly later photo, probably from the 1940s or 50s. And then special occasions. This is their peace Thanksgiving tea at the end of World War II. Quite something to think about organising that for. I mean, just in one house, you could be doing it for 450 children. And when you think about that background that we were talking about before, this is all done through prayers, donations, you know, every single tea cake, every single cup of tea was, you know, given. This is slightly earlier photograph when in 1911, when King George V came to the throne. All the girls in their bonnets and the bunting, celebrating that special occasion. And then, of course, they went on trips and outings as well. This is their charabanc that they used to go out in, sometimes on trips for a special treat or at the weekend. The sight of orphans walking around the local area was always something that people came out to watch, particularly when there was a special parade or something. We don't know where they've been or where they're going here. They may well be going up to Purdown, which is a hill just near here, because they're walking down what I think is Station Road in Ashley Down. This is now all houses. These cute little boys in their caps and the girls in their lovely capes and bonnets. Quite a sight to see. I love these ladies. I reckon this was Edwardian. These ladies' lovely hats. And some of the girls were taken to the seaside sometimes, and the boys, for a treat at Clevedon, which is very near Bristol. It's kind of the seaside. We call it seaside in Bristol. It's not, it's kind of the Severn estuary really. But I love this chap, that this teacher that took them, just looks so Victorian. This is them in the local park, St Andrew's Park, which is about a 10-minute walk from here. And again, a parade. They're definitely walking back from Purdown here. So once a year, when it was George's birthday, on the 27th of September, they had that whole week off school, and they did some lovely activities like blackberry picking and games. And they had this a picnic up on Purdown where they played, and they had a lovely picnic. They had cake, which was a real treat, up on the hill just near the Orphan Homes. So they're eating their cake, looking very pleased with themselves. There's a lot of food and drink to transport up the hill, as you can imagine. They're probably all lining up for a drink. And of course, it was a lovely day for the staff as well. It was a day off for them. Some of the older girls would have waited on the staff. So that's an insight into what orphan life was like for the children. This is a few little pictures of our museum here. If you live in Bristol, or if you're ever coming through or past Bristol, we would love to see you. There's lots more to see here. If you wanted to bring family, children, great. There's lots for children to do as well. It's free to come in, and you can discover a bit more as well about what we do now as a charity.